All right, boys, we're now live, and we've got fisheries biologist Mr. Preston Chrisman. I'm pronouncing that right, aren't I?
Yep, that's right.
Preston Chrisman with us tonight, and I have been looking forward to this conversation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when I first started going kind of online on Instagram, you were in school, right?
Yeah, probably.
Mm-hmm. And I can just remember us having discussions about your thesis,
Yep.
and it was really interesting and really backed up what I had observed, in my career managing ponds throughout the Southeast.
Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit about that project and
Sure.
what you did and how it worked.
Sure. So I'm a sport fish biologist with South Carolina DNR, and so we have 20-ish what we call state lakes. They're lakes in our state lakes program. These are kind of small impoundments. They range anywhere from a half acre to 300 acres. They varying levels of management. Some you can't really manage at all. Others are nice big bass lakes. A lot are bass crowded. So with the drop in largemouth bass harvest, as you've mentioned a lot on your channels, that's hampering some of our opportunities to produce big bass in these smaller systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so we wanted to look at a way that maybe we could establish like a protocol, a way to kind of go in and make it repeatable at other lakes. Go in, see if we can thin out the bass with using an electrofishing boat, since we've lost that angler harvest component.
Mm-hmm.
So we picked 2 lakes kind of as the initial study, and it just doubled as a thesis. I was going back to grad school online at the University of Florida to get my master's degree. So that was online, and it involved a thesis type project. So we just rolled that right in and did it for both. So we went to both lakes. One's 40 acres, one is 25, and
Okay.
they were both heavily bass crowded, and we wanted to remove some fish and kind of see if we could rebalance them.
Now, for our beginner type viewers, what does bass crowded mean to you? Define that.
Yeah. So it's once bass in small impoundments, they're really good at 2 things, and one is reproducing, and the other is eating bluegill. So they reproduce like crazy in ponds and in these simple systems where it's really just bass, bluegill. We stock shellcracker, and we stock channel catfish in a lot of places. Usually anglers will end up bringing us black crappie as well. We don't stock them, but they end up in the lakes, and that's most of the systems. So bass are the top predator in pretty much all of them. So they reproduce. There's nothing really to keep their numbers down except themselves, which they don't do quite well enough. So they become too populated, and so there's not enough food to go around. So they kind of stop growing. So you end up with a lake full of 10 to 14 inch bass. They just hammer the 3 to 5 inch bluegill, so you don't see any of those. But once a bluegill reaches like 6 or 7 inches, then there's no bass big enough to eat it. So you end up with a decent number of trophy bluegill, which is another name for a bass crowded lake, is a trophy bluegill lake. So you see a good number of big bluegill and big shellcracker. And then those, since they're reproducing every month and they're big females and males, they do a pretty good job at reproducing. So you end up with a whole bunch of 1 to 2 inch bluegill and a whole bunch of 6, 7 inch plus bluegill, nothing in between.
Right.
And so, those bass they starve, they quit growing, they get skinny. If one were ever to reach 2 pounds, they could then start eating the other bass. So you do see a few kind of rock star type fish that
Right.
hit that 6, 7, 8, 9 pound mark. But
I think that's what confuses guys the most, is those systems occasionally will put off an absolute unit that's feeding on other bass.
Yep.
And that tricks people into thinking that it's a healthy bass population.
That's right.
When in fact it's not. I remember one project that I did, back when the dinosaur age. There was a guy that I didn't get to participate in the fishing, but I was there for the conversations. And I actually probably can't even mention where it was, but it was a 750 acre lake that was closed. So there was no fishing whatsoever. Nobody fished in it. And they got permission to fish there because, like your thesis, the guy was doing it. he wasn't necessarily doing it on fish growth, but he was doing it on fishing pressure.
Sure.
And the effects of fishing pressure. And it's very rare to find a 750-acre lake that has zero fishing pressure.
Yeah.
But they got in and they were able to fish there, and it had been there for years on an industrial site. And there was two size classes of bass. There was 1 pounders and there was bass that could eat 1 pounders.
Yeah.
And since they had never seen any kind of lures or anything, they were not hard to catch. They jumped on everything. Every station, guys caught fish. Dr. Gilbert told me that when he started that day, everything was measured. Everybody fished a certain area for a certain period of time, certain lure ranges and things like that. Dr. Gilbert said he went 28 for 28 on his first 28 casts.
Oh, wow.
And broke off, retied, and did it again. And they were like I said, they were either 1 pound, 1.5 pounds, or like 9-10 pounds.
Yeah.
And all the fish were easy to catch. It was an incredible story of going almost back to back on 10s, fishing.
Wow.
But again, we've moved to 750 acres. Which is significantly larger than 50 acres, 40 acres, 30 acres. And that's where I come in, where, that was my domain, was the ponds and the smaller lakes up to about 50 acres, usually in your homeowners associations. That's what I had to deal with. But I saw exactly what you described. Just thousands and thousands and thousands of 1 pound fish everywhere.
Yeah.
So what did you guys do? How many did you harvest? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So we kind of set up, we made since it was doubling as a thesis, we came in with a pretty strong plan. So we wanted to get an estimate of the number of bass that were in each lake.
Okay.
So to do that, we went out and sampled the whole shoreline, and every bass we caught, we cut the half of one pelvic fin off. So we gave it a fin clip.
Sure.
We came back in June and we sampled the whole shoreline again. And then we were examining those fish, and the proportion of fish that we caught that had the fin clips. There's a math calculation that gives you a rough population estimate. So we did that at both lakes. And interestingly, they both came out with almost exactly the same estimated population size. So even though one is 40 acres and one is only 25, they both had roughly the same number of bass in there. So that kind of is going to give you a hint as to the end story here. But
yeah.
So we then set a target of we wanted to remove 40 to 50% of that population.
Wow.
So we went into both places and we hammered them.
Big.
We shocked all June and into July, and it was hot. It was miserable. Catch rates plummeted, both from the heat and from moving bass out.
Yeah.
We also used relative weight as our criteria to harvest. So we set it at 95. Any bass that we caught that was at 95 or higher, we let go.
Right.
Any bass that was below 95, we harvested. And if you guys have been following Shan's page, you should know what relative weight is. But if not, it's a measure of fish condition, basically how plump a fish is. If it's a certain length, that you have done all the math calculations in the past, it should weigh X. And if it's only at 95% of that or less, we took it out. And so in those two bass crowded lakes, that was like 90% of the fish we caught were below that. So very few fish got tossed back. So we killed a lot of fish. And I'll say that we killed them. We did not move them anywhere. We thought about it, but really, like I said, most of our lakes are already bass crowded. Nowhere else needed 1 pound bass that aren't really going to ever grow to reach 4 pounds or even 2 pounds. And then you run into issues of spreading disease and stuff around too. So we did make the decision. We just killed them. And so I've got the numbers here pulled up. We harvested, the first year we harvested just under 1,000 at the 40 acre lake and just a little over 1,100 at the 25 acre. And so at the 25 acre, we took out 50%. At the 40 acre, we took out 41.
Wow. That's impressive work.
It was a grind. Yeah.
That's very impressive. And I know people don't understand because they've never worked on an electrofishing boat and they think that you just turn it on and all the fish float up. But that is far and away from the.
Yes.
And you did it all with electric fishing, no netting, nothing, just all juice.
all the electric fishing boat. So we started just as an example at the 40-acre lake. We were before we started harvesting, we were catching 200 bass per hour. At the end of the study, and that one really only removed that first 1,000. We didn't remove any more. Our catch rates had dropped to about 45 an hour. So we really made a big dent in that population.
Yeah, you did. Okay. So from 200 fish per hour shocked up to 45 fish per hour. And then what did you see relative weight wise?
Yep. So at that lake, so I'll just tale of two lakes really for this whole project. The 40-acre lake, which, as we said, had the same number of bass as the 25-acre, so it was less severely crowded to begin with.
Right.
We made much better progress at that lake. So we took out 1,000. The plan was to come back the following year and take out another 40 to 50%. But we saw some really good indicators that we had made good progress. So we decided to not harvest additional. And that was our bluegill catch rates more than tripled. They went from like 100 an hour or 150 up to about 600 bluegill an hour.
Oh, nice.
And then our bass numbers, like I said, that catch rate was down at about 60 per hour, I think, that first year.
Okay.
Condition improved, average size. We saw a lot more in that 14 to 16 inch size range rather than the 10 to 12. So we saw that condition of the was the relative weight of the bass improved. The bluegill catch rates, we were like, all right, let's ease off on that one and we'll see how it goes. And it is still, even sampling last year, we haven't hit it this year, but last year it held, and it's still about 40 bass an hour. We're not exploding in our growth. Like, we're not seeing lots of 4s and 5s, but we're seeing lots of 2.5s and 3s, which for that lake has been a far improvement.
Phenomenal. Wouldn't you attribute that to the fish just being, since they were in a stunted condition, they're going to be older fish and not grow quite as fast?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. That lake also has threadfin shad, which is another difference between the two. The 25-acre did not.
Okay.
So I think that might have helped us a little bit too. Maybe it took some pressure off of those bluegill, and that's why those bluegill had a really good reproductive cycle that first year. So bluegill catch rates staying high, bass rates are still low. And
did you guys put those shad in after you did the harvest?
It was before. Yeah.
Oh, you did it before. Oh, wow.
Yeah, we had done that, established that a couple years before we started removing. So I think that dual combination of the shad and removing bass really seemed to knock that one. They're in South Carolina. I mean, there's no secret here.
Phillips in South Carolina.
Okay, so Lake Oliphant is the 40-acre lake we made a lot better progress at. That is in Chester County, and then the other one is Jonesville Reservoir, which is 25 acres, and it is near the town of Jonesville, and that is in Union County, I believe. So both kind of in the upstate of South Carolina, about dead in the middle of the state towards the top.
Nice. Rock Hill.
Yeah. I'm in Rock Hill, so I'm just across the border from Charlotte, essentially.
Right.
And then they're a little bit to my southwest, but
right on. Okay, so I have experienced exactly that in my smaller work than 40 acres, but 40 acres I've been on many 40-acre lakes and experienced this as well. Sometimes, and I think it depends on how long the fish have been stunted. A simple, quick harvest just corrects it. It just fixes it. And I think my observation on that too is you have, like we talked about previously, we do have a few big bass in there, right?
Yeah.
And they're feeding on 1 pound bass. Well, I've noticed a pattern that when you go in and get a bulk of those 1 pound bass out and shift that population back towards bluegill, those bigger bass, that people start catching them again because they're much easier to catch. Instead of feeding on a 1 pound meal, now they've got to go hunt and bluegill and smaller. To consume the food they need. That gets them feeding more often. And I saw that a bunch of times. You just go in, thin the 1 pounders out, and then the next spring somebody's yanking a 9.5 out of there. That was a real common pattern, and I couldn't figure it out for many years, but I think that's what it is.
Okay. I mean, that checks out. Like I said, we haven't sampled either of those lakes this spring, but we had an angler survey going on this spring, and our guy that was out there going out there and talking to anglers, he talked to 3 different people at that lake that had caught 8-pound fish this year. Now, whether those are actually 8-pound fish or a 5-pounder that they caught an 8, but either way, it sounds better than it used to. So
right, that sounds much better. Now, so it sounds like if you have a 40-acre lake and a 20-acre lake, and they have the same numbers of bass in it from your calculation, that means the 20-acre lake there was twice as many bass in it
per
acre.
That's right.
So how did that work out?
About the opposite. So, like I said, we removed more bass out of the smaller lake and came back that second year hoping we were going to see the same kind of thing, that bluegill were going to skyrocket and our bass catch rates were going to stay low. And bass catch rates were lower, but they actually were stunting at an even smaller size. Like we only saw 8 to 10 inch fish instead of 12 to 14s.
Right.
And our bluegill catch rates also decreased. So we decided to remove another 40 to 50%. And so then that year we took out about 800, I think, off the top of my head, an additional 800. And that one was a real grind. Catch rates we were down to like 15 bass an hour, still trying to pull them out of there. So eventually we just had to stop. Yeah. So I think we got right at about 40% of that estimated population, which the population estimate came down to. So it's like fewer bass, but they were not growing. So we took out an additional 800, came back the following year, the third year, to kind of just get the final snapshot and hoping that maybe that had made a dent. And they were still stacking up at 8 to 10 inches. That lake produces an above average number of those rock star fish. We had a lot of 8s and up to 9.5s. So above average there, but they were not growing. Our bluegill didn't bounce back at all either. So it's kind of just a tale of 2 different lakes there.
Yeah, and I've seen that as well, where it seems like just no matter how hard you work.
Yeah.
And just give people an idea, how many hours or how many days did that take you? How many nights did that take you?
Let's see. I got that pulled up here somewhere. So let's see. Oh, I thought I did. It was probably, I think it was about a dozen days spent on each lake, and that usually had 2 boats going.
Oh, you had 2 electrofishing boats.
We would start beside each other, go all the way around the lake till we met each other, and we would do that at least 3 times a day.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, when you figure, the labor and the travel and the expense for a 20-acre lake for 2 electrofishing boats, I'm just lining all this up. I couldn't even mathematically $1,500 a day per boat, roughly $3,000 total, $30,000. You're getting into the realm of draining and restocking would be a much cheaper and easier solution to that problem.
Yep. Unfortunately, that's typically not an option for us.
Right.
Our agency does not have regulatory authority. So that means if we want to go out and change the largemouth bass minimum length regulation, a law has to be passed. So if we want to close a lake, a law has to be passed. And typically, what county, state legislator is going to vote to close a fishing lake when he starts hearing?
No.
So generally we only get to drain and restock these places when the spillway has to be serviced, replaced, repaired, something like that.
Right.
It's typically about the only time we can do that. So that was another reason behind us wanting to do this. Try to come up with some way, since renovation is typically not an option for us.
Right. And for our private landowners here, they always opted with me to do your plan. Let's not drain it. Let's try to save it.
Right.
And it was always just significantly more expensive than if you just pulled the plug,
and not guaranteed to work.
And
as we showed, we got maybe it worked at one place, it's looking good. The other one, it didn't work at all. So we're 3-4 years down the road, and think of what you could have had you pulled the plug right then.
Exactly. You could have that nice new lake effect that we're experiencing at Sugar Hill, growing, 14. We had some spawn in our electrofishing survey. Fish spawned in from last year that were 14.5 inches and 100 and 102% relative weight. We had some feeder issues in the pond, and we upgraded the feeder, and I didn't see the 3 to 4 inch, just like you described. I didn't see the 3 to 4 inch, hardly any. We saw a few shellcracker, but there was a distinct gap in the forage just at year 3.
Yeah.
And that's, again, I've had a lot of experience training in stocking ponds new. And that's why I had Garrett come out. Shout out to Garrett Stanport over at Pristine Pond Management for helping us out with that. He did a great job. That young man just got out of Texas A&M, and he's a fine biologist. Yeah, so we upgraded the feeder and got a nice new directional, and we'll keep the feeding more consistent this season. And I put a 30 fish in the 1 pound range. We saw, it was interesting. We saw like some fry from this year. The water was muddy, and we were getting like 8 ounce of current. So so it was cooking everything up.
Yeah.
But we saw reproduction from this year. And of course, I've been tracking the bass enough to know that all the fish are not 1.2 to 1.4. They're past that, the original stock. So those ones that were 1.4, I know were born last year. Plus I have my fish tagged, but then I found like some 6 to 8s.
Yeah.
So where did that come from? I'm thinking it had to have been a late summer, fall spawn, know?
I think we're seeing more of that up our way.
I have seen that a few times in my career. And as soon as I saw that fish come up, I netted it and threw it. It was on the video. If you guys watch the video, it's probably like I did a scoop of like 1 to 2 inch bluegill. And then I did the shell cracker, and me and Rudd broke that down. And then the very next bass I picked up was like that 8 inch fish. And I instantly knew, like, boom, that's not right. But that's just from experience. You wouldn't know that without being on a shocking rig. And I knew instantly that I had more than 2 spawns. And then we discussed it briefly on the boat. I think I cut that conversation off in my editing, but we can retouch on that. And that's really important for guys to understand too, that the bass, especially those healthy bass in those new lake situations, will crank out reproduction. I can't express that enough, really.
Yeah, and I think that is an issue that plagued us at the smaller lake. We did go back after we removed fish that kind of early summer. We went back that fall, and we saw a lot of young of year. So we thinned out as much of those as we could too, but it just seems like compensatory recruitment kicked in. And so we took out all those 10 to 12 inchers, but they just, the survival on that year class of fish just compensated for it. So we were right back where we started had we not removed fish at all. So
that's interesting, isn't it? Right back where all that work for absolutely no measurable results.
Yep.
And I touch on that a lot, in the ponds. It's like, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you do this? Why don't you stock this or that? And it's like, because I've done all of those things before and I got no measurable results.
Yeah.
Yep. And if you're going to spend money, that's fine. I'll sell you stuff. But at the same time, you want to get some results from it.
Yeah.
Spending money and getting nothing.
Yep.
What's the point in that? Right. So that's all very, very interesting information. You got anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think we kind of hit everything. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me about working as a state biologist. I mean, you mentioned the one thing that jumped out at me right there is the finger pointing always goes right at you guys. And I try to defend you guys as much as I can. It's always, well, the state biologist, but you don't control the regulations, politicians do.
Right. We can.
So, until we educate the public on what the actual problem is, and their votes then can influence the manage of our fisheries.
Yep.
So stop pointing the finger at the biologist and start pointing the finger at where it actually lies, and that's in politics. And if there was enough people who said, hey, man, this is not acceptable.
Yeah.
and you're going to do something about it or you're going to get voted out, guess what? All those laws will start changing.
Yeah.
And that's really what drives me, is to get this information to people so those changes can start happening for our bass populations. Because for 30 years, I've been looking at this, and I'm sick and tired of looking at starved bass populations that can't grow.
Yeah.
And really tired of the arguments that come along, even when we got super educated, it doesn't matter. Like, it's almost like the work we do doesn't matter to people. They won't listen to it.
Yeah. A similar issue, I'm not going to say anything else about it, but a similar issue popped up recently where us biologists were completely saying, don't let this one thing happen. And political types just said, well, it's going to happen. So,
yeah.
Those are frustrating days.
Yes. I can understand. And I always work for myself. I very briefly worked for other companies, mergers and things like that. And once you have the freedom of self-employment and the decision-making, everything's on you. It's my decision. If I mess it up, I mess it up. It's on me. If I don't mess it up, it's whatever. I'm responsible for me when I'm self-employed. I hated working for other people. Even, biologists, people who are similar education, similar businesses. It just was terrible. The decision-making was, not what I agreed with. So day to day though, what's your job as a state biologist? What are you doing?
Yeah. So I guess I'll kind of just work through the kind of the annual calendar. So right now we're out electrofishing. We are hitting our big reservoirs, looking for bass. That'll be, for us, it's largemouth, smallmouth. We have invasive Alabama bass, and then we have a native form of the red-eye bass, which is the Bartram's bass. We have 4 species in the state. So we were out on a few of our big reservoirs this year, sampling those. We're starting on Lake Wiley is a pretty famous one. We're starting on that one this week. We'll be capturing every bass we catch, doing 30-minute runs at a time. We're going to pull some otoliths from bass out there, both largemouth and Alabamas that are in that lake, to get some age and growth information.
Mm-hmm.
Once we wrap up the big reservoirs, we move to those smaller systems, those our state lakes. Those are those 0 to 300 acres in size. And there we're looking at bass, bluegill, red-ear sunfish, and black crappie if they have them. So we'll sample those with electrofishing. We go back to those places in June as well to get a second sample in, with the idea that we go once in like April or early May when the bass are theoretically shallow and spawning, and then we come back in June when the bluegill are shallow, just so we kind of get a more accurate representation.
Sure.
We wrap that up in June. Then we move on to our coastal rivers. We do a coastal river survey every year, and that's more of like a full community. We're collecting every fish we see, and we're catching all kinds of stuff. We see saltwater species mixed in as well. We get some flounder, mullet, stuff like that. Bass, bowfin, all that kind of stuff. Those are blackwater rivers that'll last until
in that brackish water area is where you're electrofishing. Yeah.
So we go pretty much the whole length of the river. We have sites throughout.
Right.
High frequency sites, which is kind of what you guys saw in Shan's video the other day. That's high frequency. We also have there's a low frequency setting that really just targets catfish. It just kind of overloads their sensory systems, and they just float. So they get influenced by it and come up a lot further away. So we do some catfish sites too on those rivers. And so that lasts until early September. Once October rolls around, we are trap netting for black crappie on one of our larger reservoirs. And then December, we start gill netting on one of our larger reservoirs, and that's looking at striped bass, blue catfish are the 2 primaries. And then we also kind of really interested in white bass and black crappie, but they catch all kinds of other stuff too. And so that goes on all winter. And then after Christmas, if depending on the year, we might be sinking Christmas trees somewhere, doing other types of habitat improvement stuff. And then it kind of rolls right into spring. So there's really not much of a slowdown. I would say February might be the slowest month, but it's getting busier and busier.
You're staying on it hard. Is Kiwi? It's like Kiwi in your area?
That is not. So that would be out of our Clemson region.
I got you. I used to fish in a bass club in Athens. Used to go up to Kiwi a lot.
Yeah,
enjoyed fishing up there. Good little lake.
Yeah.
when I had Drew Gregory on, he talked quite a lot about the Alabama bass. Is there a way that you can identify an Alabama from a normal spot?
Ooh, so that's tough. I think one of the biggest ones for me is body shape.
Okay.
Spotted bass, just they don't grow as long. They stay nice and chunky and fat. Alabama bass, they're like a torpedo. I mean, they are just long and cylindrically shaped. That's a big one. I think you can get into like some scale counts and things like that. But that's always tough.
Right.
And then if they're in the same system together, they could be hybridizing. And so then there's really just without taking a fin clip and sending it off for a genetics result, it can be next to impossible to really tell them apart. But if you know you had one of each and you said which is which, you could probably do it visually. Right. But if you don't know, or if they're hybrids, it can get tough. Which, I mean, Alabama bass was a subspecies up until 2008 when they elevated it to a full species.
To a full species. I noticed they did that with largemouth too, didn't they?
They just recently, in the last year, they've split Florida and the northern largemouth. And then not only that, they've reassigned scientific names too.
Yeah.
Because the original largemouth bass, so that's Salmoides, Micropterus salmoides, was identified near Charleston. And so that had been the name for the northern largemouth bass. And then they elevated Florida bass to its own species. So that had been Micropterus floridanus. But then when a recent paper came out where they looked at a more accurate range of Florida bass, which they now know extended naturally up into the southern part of South Carolina, Georgia, kind of the coastal plain of those areas. So a little bit further north than what we had always thought, that fish was most likely a Florida bass since it came near Charleston. So they gave Micropterus salmoides to the Florida bass, and now the rest of the northern largemouth is now Micropterus nigricans.
That's interesting.
So scientific names can still change too in this day and age.
We had a discussion with Alex Rudd on the boat, and this is by far not scientific. We have our northern bass pit tagged. And the reason I did that is I figured I would be harvesting the Floridas. I don't get really great growth. I've never really have on pure Floridas in ponds in Georgia. And guys constantly want to put them in. So that was part of my project, was differentiating between the two species now. I was about to say seven species, but two species now. One interesting thing that I noticed, though, was the northern bass were, again, we were dealing with really stained water. They were really, really gold, just had that shift in color. But the Florida bass in that pond did not. They stayed the greener color. And then the fish that were 1.2 to 1.4 pounds in a year old also exhibited that they didn't shift into the yellowish color as well. I'm assuming it could possibly be an F1. That was the goal of this, was to have the two species in there to try to naturally create an F1 year after year, again, without going and doing genetic tests, who knows?
Yeah. Right.
But I do know that if any F1s are born, they're going to dominate everything around them.
Yeah.
They are exceptionally aggressive and fast growing. So that's a fun part of that project. But, Rudd was pretty accurate in his ability to identify Floridas from northerns. Do you have any tips on doing that? I don't have any of those.
No. So my part of the state, we don't really have any pure Floridas. We are naturally on the gradient zone. So we have in like the Santee Cooper lakes and in the southeastern part of the state, we have pretty much pure Floridas, like 98%, or maybe even higher. So like Santee Cooper lakes that are pretty famous.
I didn't realize that. That's interesting.
They are pure Floridas.
No kidding.
And then if you follow that gradient up to like Lake Hartwell in the upper left corner of the state, that one is like 85% northern.
Okay.
But no individual fish are pure northern. They are all just mixtures of the two. So we have no pure northerns, but we do have pretty much pure Floridas and then everything in between. And it follows that gradient right up the state. So in my area, that generally leads to somewhere in the where each individual bass is somewhere in the neighborhood of like 60% northern, 40% Florida, typically.
That makes sense. I mean, I've seen so many, stock so many ponds, and then, inevitably you'll get some washover.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff will go out down the streams, and from all the ponds, and they'll end up. So if you had F1s, you're going to have Florida genetics because you started out. Most of the fish hatcheries for years, just people didn't know they were buying F1s, but that's what they were selling them. Almost since the beginning of my career, it was an F1, simply because the fish hatchery wanted the fish to grow. When they sold people fish, they wanted the fastest growing fish. So most of the fish that I stocked were the F1.
Yeah.
And got great growth out of them, 15 up to 15 and a half inches in a year when you lower the stocking rate down to around 40 per acre. I find that interesting that you kind of came around those numbers and started seeing better growth in that 40 acre lake.
Yeah.
You said you were around 40 fish per acre or 40 fish per hour.
Yeah. 40 per hour. Yeah.
40 per hour. Right on.
Yeah.
Very, very good. So I guess that brings us to the podcast that you just recently were. What are you considered the host of the podcast? What's your title there?
Yeah, so it's called the Fisheries Podcast. It's been ongoing for a long time. We just hit the 250th episode, and so the original founder, he started getting busy, so he started adding co-hosts. So they have 5 co-hosts now. There's kind of 4 main ones, so we're just responsible for 1 episode per month. And then the 5th guy does those rare months where you have a 5th Sunday, so he's kind of the fill-in for those. And it's kind of geared more towards other fisheries biologists, but I think there's a lot to take away from the general angling community. And so we have a good mix of co-hosts. We have some marine focused people. We have some people that are kind of out west that do a lot of the salmonid stuff. Yeah, I'm obviously, most of the guests that I'm interviewing are kind of your freshwater sport fish types. So I think there's plenty to be gleaned, from a common angler's perspective. So it's the Fisheries Podcast. Feel free to give it a listen. I had an episode a couple weeks ago, just last week, where I interviewed a fellow sport fish biologist from North Carolina. Just kind of show, what the work that he's doing, his master's project. Seth Miko.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll check that one out.
Yeah, it was a good one.
Yeah, I think it's an awesome podcast, and I try to keep an eye on it as best I can.
Yeah,
it definitely goes, a level higher than what I'm presenting, because you're dealing with people who are highly educated, PhD level type people doing very intense research.
Yeah,
that's punching way above my weight. I'm just a pond manager. But yeah, it's been really interesting. Getting that diversity and showing people the diversity of the fisheries and how everything is different.
Yeah,
it kind of drives me crazy, like the catch and release type of mentality, where that's just been rubber stamp approval. That's how these fisheries are managed, and it's not how those fisheries. That's just complete misinformation. And getting other people's perspectives and getting other scientists' perspectives on how they're managing those fisheries, I think, is critically important. As well as, I don't know that necessarily. Well, maybe that's not the right way to say it. I was about to say that won't make you a better fisherman, but actually it will make you a better fisherman when you understand the biology of the fish that are in your areas.
Yeah.
Now, is it going to give you, tips on how to drag the worm or whatever? No. But when you start understanding the biology and physiology of the fish and the forage fish and the bass and then taking it another level up, I think guys get confused with, well, what about northern lakes? Mm-hmm. Well, you've got another level of predator. The lakes that we are managing, we might be adding some hybrid striper or some striper to help control shad populations out in the middle. But there's not another level of predator above the largemouth bass. Like, those are our top predators, where when you start getting into pike country, musky country, bass just become forage.
Yeah.
And that changes, natural lakes like that. up there, that's a different system than what we're dealing with down here.
Oh yeah.
So I think what you're doing is great, and I'll certainly copy it and promote it, as best I can.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, man. I appreciate you coming on and talking with us like this.
Yeah. Anytime.
I'm
I
gonna
see the one question. Yes, the Fisheries Podcast is very nerd friendly. That is.
I'm going to scroll back. I've been talking to you and I haven't been looking. Guys, throw some comments or questions in here and we'll be glad to answer them.
Yeah.
Let's see. I just want to make sure that I didn't miss any questions back. Like I said, I've been looking at you more than I've been looking at the questions.
Yeah.
I don't see anything. So put it back up there if you ask me a question and I missed it. Here we go. Midwest. What's up, Midwest? Thanks for coming back, man. Longtime supporter of Midwest fishermen there. Yes. Yes. It's a perfect analogy to deer hunting. Yep. I've stated this many times. They teach all of these general principles the first year you're in fisheries school in a class called Fish and Wildlife Biology. So they do that because the ideas are exactly the same. Doing catch and release only like we have for the past 30 years would be the same thing as telling deer hunters that you're now going to be hunting with paintball guns.
Yep.
All right. And what would happen to your wildlife population without some harvest? And I've actually saw an article online the other day that hunting has dropped in, I don't remember where it was, but it's dropped to such low levels that they're actually reintroducing predators to control the deer populations. Which, if they're going to be taking out dogs, cats, you're going to have different types of problems with predators.
I use that analogy all the time when describing this issue. I've made all kinds of circuits because my thesis project, the bass removal project, was published in a journal, and so I did a lot of presentations on it at various fisheries conferences and things like that, as well as to like our advisory board. So I use that analogy of if deer season's canceled, now what do you do?
Exactly.
So it's almost the same exact thing.
Yeah, it really is almost the same exact thing. And the funny part about it is a lot of the guys that are such staunch defenders of catch and release are also deer hunters.
Yeah.
So why there's like that, not getting that connection, I can't figure out. And that's really what drives me. That's what keeps me going is just let's just try to straighten out the misinformation.
Yeah.
And get our bass populations, healthy again. Here's one coming through from Chris. Curly pond weeds taking over many small lakes in central, is that Iowa or Illinois? I don't have my glasses, so I can't really tell.
I think it's Iowa, I believe.
Need my readers. I'm getting old. Really clear water. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, we'll touch curly pond weed, but let's talk about the efforts that you guys use for controlling aquatic vegetation and the importance of that.
Yeah. So I'll just start off with whenever grass carp are stocked into a reservoir or there's a big spraying program, I can't speak for every state, but I know in most states, that's not us. That is not your DNR. That is almost always the power company that owns the lake. Mm-hmm. However, we know everyone blames us that they're DNR's killing all the grass and making fishing terrible. I promise, my opinion, not my agency's opinion.
Yes.
Cover my butt a little bit.
Right.
I would love to have grass in our lakes because I know it makes better habitat for bass up to a certain point, and then it becomes a problem. And the power companies, they're trying to make money. And so when they have massive amounts of whatever it is, hydrilla or anything that's causing damage or costly cleaning efforts of their turbines and their trash grates and all those things, it makes sense to control it. I wish we could find a better way to get a balance in there to where it's not completely eradicated or massive damage to the If we could have, and there are states that are doing some stuff. North Carolina and Georgia both have greenhouses with their DNR. They have greenhouses where they are growing aquatic plants. They're planting them. They've gotten the power company buy-ins. They allow certain species, ones that shouldn't get too problematic.
Right.
And they're going out there. You have to close them off to keep grass carp from eating them immediately. But the idea is you build a nice big nest colony, and then it'll fragment and eventually take hold throughout the lake. So they're growing some plants in some reservoirs. I'd love to see us take on a similar effort.
Mm-hmm.
So now where my agency does come in to doing some spraying and things like that are water bodies that are public, that are not controlled and owned by power companies. So that would be a lot of like our larger rivers. And they'll go out there and spray nuisance vegetation in some situations. So, and we will stock grass carp and spray because we own our state lakes, those smaller water bodies that I've been talking about a lot tonight. So that we have a separate, that's not our fisheries biologist. We have like a separate state lakes crew.
Okay.
That are statewide. They do all the grass cutting, trash pickup. We help them, but they do a lot of like the trail maintenance. There's a lot of fishing access trails that go around these lakes. So keeping trees that fall down, things like that, keeping fishing piers repaired. And then they do fertilizing and liming operations. And then they'll handle the aquatic vegetation issues.
Well, you'd be the perfect guy to ask this question. Say you have a lake and it had the vegetation, and then for whatever reason the vegetation has been controlled, been removed.
Yeah.
Do you see any difference in the relative weights in the condition of the bass?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because we have one of these smaller lake. I guess it's 300 acres, so it's not really small, but it is in our state lakes program, and this lake operates on some insane cycles that I have never seen anywhere else. But it's like you have it where it's nice and green and it's nice and fertile, and you catch really nice big bass, lots of them. And then it'll go through this cycle of that for about 2 years. And then whatever reason, like that spring, I guess plants just got an earlier hold or something. So then you have all these plants grow up. The water is super clear because all those nutrients are being taken out of the water column by the plants, the actual plants, macrophytes that are growing. So then your phytoplankton is not getting those nutrients. So the lake's less fertile. You instantly see fewer fish. Total biomass, you see fish that are in poor condition. Like it is crazy. And then a hurricane will come through and scour out all the vegetation, and then it goes back to green and fertile. And it's insane to see. But it's every couple of years it'll switch and flip flop like that from one extreme to the other.
Isn't that interesting? I've never seen that before, but I have certainly seen in my pond management where the lakes were allowed to be. Well, the lakes or ponds were neglected, and the plants grew up, and you get your lake water that looks like this, and you got no green water, you got no phytoplankton, and then you get rid of the plants, you get the green color back. That just drives the system right back up.
Yeah.
And the bass fatten right back up simply from controlling the vegetation.
Yeah.
And it seems to be that the public thinks that it's the opposite. The plants are the necessary habitat for the fish.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm not saying it's not good habitat. Obviously, it's good habitat up to a point.
Yeah.
At that point, it's clear in the phytoplankton bloom, you've got a serious problem. Not beneficial at all.
Yeah.
At what point will you guys get motivated to start controlling?
Depends on the plant in immense fashion. At that lake that I just mentioned, hydrilla popped up last year. So we put in the budget request, and some grass carp are going in. Either they just did or very soon. And hopefully that'll help keep all of the plants controlled, so we can get that nice green color and get it back to being fertile. But a lot of our other smaller lakes, if it's just like peripheral vegetation, like alligator weed, primrose, we see a lot of parrot feather. Usually we'll just let those kind of go. We might spot treat a little bit around popular bank access spots, just because it's harder to get your hook in and out if it's growing too much. But we'll usually let it rock along and not be too much if it's just peripheral stuff. But
Very interesting. All right, let's see.
And just another one last thing on grass, I'll say, but for like larger reservoirs is more what I'm thinking. But grass is great habitat, but fishermen love it because it's a fish concentrator, right? I mean, it brings the fish into a small area. Anybody can go fish a patch of hydrilla and smash some fish,
right?
And it's unfortunate.
I think that is that's what gives the misconception that the fishery's been ruined because you got rid of the grass.
Right. The fish didn't leave.
Hasn't been ruined. You've just made it a lot harder to catch the fish.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah,
fish are still there.
Exactly.
They're going to be out doing their normal things rather than all sucked into that little truck-sized patch of hydrilla that topped out or something like.
Okay, now we've got so many questions. Let's go to Eric here. Oh, that's a good question. Actually, I've done that several times. I've crossed up regular bluegill with coppernose in my ponds, just for genetic diversity. The coppernose just take feed a little bit better, a little bit easier feed train. That's what we got in Sugar Hill is the coppernose bluegill, and I didn't go out of my way to go buy them. That's just what they had available at the hatchery. That's another thing guys really don't understand is, I want this, I want that, well, you've got to get that. Somebody has to be selling that, I couldn't get any red ear when I initially stocked Sugar Hill. He said there was a mix, but I kind of sifted through, and I didn't see any that went into this mix. So the following season, I had to go get some red ear that were just like 2-inch, and I'm putting them into the pond with bass, and I'm like, oh geez. So I ended up stocking like 800 red ear into a 2.5 acre pond. But you know what? I saw 4 or 5 4-inch red ear during my shock survey. So that stocking rate got enough in there, and it got them established. And so I was happy to see that.
Yeah. One other nice thing about being a state biologist and managing these small lakes is you have a state hatchery system backing you up.
Yes, sir.
So we get calls all the time like, hey, I've got 50,000 extra 3-inch bluegill. Where do you want them to go?
That would be awesome. Yeah, I can think of a couple places right now. That'd be awesome. That's not a problem to have at all.
No, that helps us a lot. And we'll put in requests to grow like catchable size bluegill. So they'll be spawned in like late or early summer. They'll grow them a whole like year and a half to where they're 5, 6, 7 inches.
Oh,
we do that a lot in our bass crowded lakes because if you put in 3-inch bluegill, they're all just going to get wiped out.
Smoked.
Put those guys in, hopefully you can have them spawn a few times before anglers. That is one thing that with our bass crowded trophy bluegill ponds is the guys that are there catching bluegill, they're still harvesting. So we get a lot of lakes that are heavily bass crowded, but we just still don't see those trophy bluegill just because they're getting snatched out. And so that I think even further dampens the food chain because then you don't have those guys,
you don't have the big breeders
every month.
Which brings up this question: can a handful of bank anglers improve a bass fishery? A large population of 1 pound or less fish, and it's about 30 acres. It looks like you said.
I mean, you can't hurt. It depends on how much if you have the full bank access or if you're limited to just one corner of it, it's going to be a lot harder. But yeah, I mean, if you get enough people out there harvesting enough fish, you can make a difference. But 30 acres, that's pretty big.
600 to 800 1 pounders out of that, wouldn't you say?
Yeah,
a couple years in a row. So I don't know anybody who keeps enough bass to make a difference anymore. They'll like you said, they'll catch the crappie out, they'll catch the bluegill out, but it's like the bass is worshipped in a way that it can't be touched, and it's really unfortunate because if we had some more of that, we would have consistently better bass fishing. All right, Drew's coming through here. What's he got to say? He's been calling bass for 5 years, 5 acre pond. Oh, good. That's great news, Drew. I'm glad that's helping you out. And that makes me proud that is an intelligent comment,
Yeah.
and somebody who understands what's going on. And that was my entire goal of this. So
Yeah.
you, Drew, excellent work.
Yeah. Trending in the right direction, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Yeah, I mean, Cliff, you're exactly right. We touched on that, and I'm just gonna say sure. Drew's coming through with another one here. If all your size classes of relative weight are good, the next step to keeping that balance is scaling that. Keep managing, keep measuring. You'll get, the more you write down that information and get a data set. Your 12s, 13s, 14s, 15s, and pay attention to the relative weights. You could see it in the electrofishing survey. You certainly could hire a professional and have a like Garrett come out and do your electrofishing job. I would do them once a year, but you don't really have to do them that often. You could get one done, this year and then let it go a couple years, I think, and you'll be okay. It is kind of an expensive thing to have done, but I'm really glad we did it at the pond this year. I think we were with the 3 to 4 inch bluegill missing, and just it was a perfect timing, and kind of got lucky on that. Just it lined up for us. Let's see what my man Philip's got to say. Yeah, he makes up a good point. It gets to the point where bass are so stunted that it's really starvation. It's really cruel. If you had your dog in that condition in your yard, you certainly would be in trouble.
Oh yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of our bass populations are in that literally like neglect kind of trouble. I think the 20-acre lake, I would define the 20-acre lake in your thesis as one of those.
Yeah.
That place is in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's see what Mike has to say. That's a good one, Mike. I think that's going to be dependent on the size of the body of water, the location of the body of water.
Yeah, for sure.
And touches back on how we can't kind of cookie cutter management, how each place is unique in a way, right? We can make these broad general statements about bass being crowded because bass populations have been managed the same way for 30 years. All the lakes have been managed catch and release. So it's not hard to say, hey, most of these lakes probably need some bass harvest, right? But does that mean all of these lakes need bass harvest? Absolutely not. And that's where the relative weight comes in again. When you start seeing bass in public water above 95%, especially above 100%, you're dealing with a fishery that's going to be putting out a PB.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important data that a fisherman can take from our fisheries side of it, is when to recognize, okay, I'm in the right spot. I've got, my 12, I've caught a 12.5-inch bass that weighs 1.3 pounds. Well, a standard weight on that's 1 pound. So you're looking at 130% relative weight fish. Okay. Yeah. That gives you instant information into the condition of that fish. And you instantly know, okay, then you catch a 14 and it's in the same condition, 15 in the same condition. That's giving, after about 5 or 6 fish that are over 100%, you're in the right spot.
That's right.
Now all you have to do is be patient and grind it out. Yep. Right. Whereas actually now I've got I've got another pond coming in that's 2.5 acres just down the road from Sugar Hill Outdoors at Emerald Lake. Shout out to my man Alex. He's been giving me reports. He's installed a feeder, but he has a crappie population in this 2.5 acres. And as we've discussed, your bigger lakes, crappie are fine. It's different. In smaller ponds, you absolutely don't want them in there. And so he's sending me his catch data, and I'm gonna be making a post about that probably tomorrow, definitely this week. All his relative weights are below what I'm seeing at Sugar Hill, because the bass don't have the competition from the crappie.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see. Okay, they're just talking fishing. Make sure we haven't missed anything. We're running right at an hour. I know you got kids in the background. You probably got to go.
I think they're asleep.
Are they?
It's awfully quiet. So,
I definitely touched on everything that I wanted to ask. Do you guys
Okay.
have any more questions for Preston before we get off? And we can just make this one an hour. Maybe it'll get better viewers not going so long. I've been going the distance on some of these things.
Yeah, but following up on your relative weight stuff in like larger public reservoirs, like I don't get to go fishing a whole lot, but when I do, I don't go to the lake that's 5 minutes from my house and 14,000 acres. I drive an hour and a half to the 6,500 acre lake because I know what lives in that lake.
That's
it's
right.
But,
yeah, and that's funny you say that, because when I was really young and a hard charger, I had thousands of acres of water and small bodies of water, right? Like they were all over multiple states. And there was probably 10 that I'd wet a hook in.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even bother. I mean, I guess the best way to put it is, after you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And then when you get on an electrofishing boat and you shock them and then you just don't see any good fish, don't see any good fish, don't see any good fish. It just takes your confidence away from the fishery completely. Yeah. And you just don't fish there.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, right? But hopefully once guys kind of get that attitude, then that's going to change. And they'll go, hey, instead of not going fishing there, let's get together. I would really like to see bass tournaments that in lakes like that, where it is bring them all back.
Yeah.
The man who catches the most bass wins. They're not going back into the lake.
Yeah.
We all stand around and fillet them out after it's over with. Maybe we give them to the needy. Maybe we have a fish fry.
Yeah.
I don't know the solution. I know we have in Georgia, we have Hunters for the Hungry, where meat can be donated. If somehow some kind of program like that could be set up to help the underprivileged people with our fisheries, I think that would be maybe an idea. But I don't know. I just know that you can't rely on the state guys. It's too much work. My God, look at the work it took for a 20, a 40, and a 20 acre lake. You're not going into 10,000 acres and making a difference with an electrofishing boat.
No.
You have to have a collective effort from everybody fishing there to make a difference in a fishery like that.
Yep.
And that's why it's so important to pay attention to your regulations. And of course, this runs into problems all the time that we touched on earlier. Sometimes the regulations don't match what needs to be done at the lake.
Yeah.
And that's where these conversations, I think, are so important. So guys can go to their representatives with some data and go, look, this is what needs to happen. And, maybe we can see some better bass management. I think we certainly need it. Thank you, Drew. I think the real life scenario is of the utmost importance, because the information that's cycling right now is coming from people not like Preston. It's coming from people who have a platform for whatever reason, and they're just kind of making guesses and using the stuff that they've heard and basically telling people what they want to hear. And I don't have a problem with that if you're coming from that place, from a place of honesty, from a place of, I honestly didn't know, right?
Yeah.
But I have personally reached out to guys online and said, look, man, this is misinformation, and all I get is blowback and argument, and innuendo and all kinds of nonsense. And at that point, I think when they're aware and choosing to tell people what's popular instead of what's correct, I think that's wrong.
Yeah.
And that's not helping any of us.
Yeah. And you're doing good work, because it's a tough battle to climb. Because just as an example, I was raised by a tournament fisherman as a tournament. I was fishing tournaments when I was 11 years old. I fished competitively on the Virginia Tech bass fishing team.
Did you really?
Oh yeah.
Nice.
We were number one in the country there for a brief spell when I was there.
Obviously, man.
I don't really fish tournaments anymore, but I was raised. You don't kill bass. Like, these are your pets.
I was
exactly. So, it's an uphill battle to fight, but
Yeah.
and it's not to say that every reservoir needs to be hammered and harvested either, but in a lot of even these big reservoirs, some harvest could change some stuff and start producing better fish, especially like we're dealing a lot with the Alabama bass, and they're not going away. You're not going to harvest them out, but if you harvest it enough, maybe we can get some 3, 4, 5 pound Alabama bass instead of 12-inch ones.
So. I noticed that with Lanier. I grew up in that area, and the spots when I was a kid, I mean, you could catch them. It was fun. You go out there with a white crankbait and just crank it down off rocks and catch 1 pound spots all day long.
All day.
But the bluebacks got in, and fortunately, because I can remember the doctors at school wondering, what exactly would happen to the fisheries if those highland reservoirs got blueback herring. I know they lost the white bass population in Lake Lanier. That
they eat all the eggs.
The bluebacks were bad egg eaters, and I guess the white bass and the bluebacks all stacked up in the river at the same time, and you kiss them goodbye. They did not have that effect with the spotted / Alabama bass in there. They've plumped up on them, but that is a big misconception. Lake Lanier is so popular and because it does produce those big fish.
Yeah.
But what I know about Lake Lanier is there is a massive amount of natural mortality. Reggie Weaver was the biologist out there for his career. He passed away, and I think the biologists keep changing out there. But Reggie did a mark recapture study on the spots on Lanier, and it was a ridiculous number. Didn't make it to a year old, or it was like 80%. Yeah, like there, and they also had, and he didn't know why. Of course, there was no money to figure out why that was occurring. But just know that using a lake like Lanier as a gauge to spots is not good.
Not right. Yeah.
Most of the time they're going to stun out at a pound, and you could literally go keep every spotted bass that you catch and be doing places like that a favor.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that will ever happen, but.
Yes, it'd be cool to have some bass tournaments have their normal bring back your biggest 5, but then also in states that allow it, bring back whoever brings back the most spotted Alabama bass.
Absolutely,
gets an extra cash prize or something. Add it like a big fish component, but it's
that's a brilliant idea. Yeah,
number of spotted bass.
Yeah.
In the states that allow that type of harvest, based on their regulations.
Wham Bates. All right. Welcome, Wham. Wham's a longtime supporter, talking about pros bed fishing in the early tournaments. What's your opinion on bed fishing?
It does not bother me in the slightest.
Me neither.
Females, it's been shown they don't drop all of their eggs at any one time. They'll spawn in 2 or 3 or even 4 nests. So even if you snatch a female off and haul her around the lake, she's still probably going to have eggs left. She will go spawn, most likely. If not, like we've been saying, a lot, some harvest in a lot of places would be good. So even if you had a fewer bass make it, it wouldn't be the worst thing. But the bass in a reservoir, they produce as many fry and fingerlings. Like every hatchery in the country couldn't produce the number of fish that they produce in a reservoir. So if you take off one female or 10 or 20 and they don't happen to spawn that year, you're not going to notice a difference.
No, you're not going to notice a thing at all. I see a couple of guys online that just go into fits about bed fishermen and how, and it's like, based on what? Like, because I don't know how many biologists I've had this conversation with, but absolutely no biologist I've ever seen has a problem with bed fishermen.
No,
It just doesn't. There's a complete disconnect there.
Yeah, of all the things you can be concerned about, I guess I'm speaking for largemouth particularly. Bed fishing is not that big of a deal. Smallmouth, I don't think it would either. In those northern fisheries,
Right.
But a lot of those are protected during the spawn, anyways. So
right. There's seasons.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah, Mike. Yeah. One thing that brings to mind that idea, though, about tournament fishermen, it kind of goes back to what you said about the bluegill being harvested. You're getting the adult bluegill being harvested from these bass stunted waters, which is having a negative impact, right?
Yeah.
I would think that lakes that are heavily hit with bass tournaments that are just packed out.
Yeah.
When you've got a situation where the larger bass are being tanked, held, weighed, measured, and put back multiple times per season, that's going to drastically even though they're being handled properly, even though everything's been done right. I've heard from another biologist, I can't remember what his name was. It was on Alex Rudd 3 times. If that bass is caught 3 times in the same summer and handled for a tournament, its mortality is 90% or something like that. Like, there's hardly no chance of that fish living after being caught and handled like that 3 times. Yeah. And I think that's a contributing factor to, yes, you do have mortality from bass fishing tournaments. It's the wrong end of the food chain that we want dying. We need you killing 1-pounders, not 5-pounders.
Yeah. That is a concern. There's been some research out there, and most of it's not super conclusive as far as like post-release mortality at tournaments. It is there. It can range. I know Gene Gilliland with BASS has talked a lot about this. He came up with something that, like, I think 20% maybe kind of year average. That number might not be right, but it's obviously way higher in the summer. So
right. Yeah.
In my personal ideal world, some fewer tournaments would probably be okay in the summer, to try to limit losing those. Because obviously, if you catch a 4-pounder in most places, that fish is coming with you the rest of the day. Mm-hmm. But if you catch a 1-pounder, odds are you're going to cull it out. Right. So you're like you said, you're focusing that release mortality on, unfortunately, the larger size fish. But most studies have shown that mortality is not super impactful to the population as a whole. But it's a lot of that's been done like in Oklahoma. And I think they're doing some on Toledo Bend maybe right now.
Well, it seems like Oklahoma is really on top of it. I noticed they've changed regulations and they're doing a good job over there. And Texas, obviously, doing a great job with their fisheries and bass management there. Drew brings up a good point of bluegill ravaging bass beds where he fishes. That's normal in low bass populations where you get super high relative weights. That's your indicator. Like, we get super high relative weights in the pond because our bass, and I mean super high, like over 120, 25, what'd you say, Preston? Yeah. Mm-hmm. In public water, you don't see that very much.
No.
And you see it all the time in ponds, but they're eating bluegill on steroids, basically. I'm throwing high protein fish feed to the bluegill. That translates to my bass weight. So 140% relative weight bass is common in a pond.
Yeah.
But that is not common in public water.
No.
When you start seeing that in public water, that's an indication that your bass population has dropped to the point where it can't control the bluegill population anymore. And you get those nest rating problems, and you can lose a bass population to bluegill. So that's an excellent observation, Drew, yet again. Well done.
Yeah, I'd say kind of general for my part of the state anyways, in our bigger reservoirs, if the population average as a whole above about a 90 relative weight, that's one of our better lakes. So kind of that 90 to 95 range is our best lakes. And the one I went fishing today, in fact, like I said, I drove the hour and a half. So it also has smallmouth, so that's the main reason. But
oh, that's cool, man. I don't get to catch many smallmouth. We used to have a few in North Georgia.
Yeah. I caught a 5-pound even one yesterday on a swim bait, so that was pretty epic.
Oh man, that was.
I didn't care. The rest of the weekend, I could have zeroed. I didn't care. After I caught that fish, I was done. I was happy.
I bet. That's awesome. Yeah, that's a good point. He says, when I'm done, there's still probably 40 minutes left in the podcast. Well, the only reason there is because you guys are throwing in some good questions. If you have anything else, put it up there. Otherwise, I'm going to let this man go back to doing what he needs to do. But I certainly appreciate you coming and talking about your experience, Preston.
Yeah,
and it's
absolutely.
really good to finally chat with you face to face. It's been many years that we've been kind of just missing each other.
Yeah.
You going to be at ICAST this year?
Yeah, I'll be there.
All right. Well, I'm going to come down and visit with you there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Midwest. Thank you, Wham. And Frank, as always, thank you. And you were wrong. It's not 38 minutes. It was 15 minutes and 29 seconds. Thanks, Preston. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.